A world tour for a group like Blackpink can mean more than 100 shows, across dozens of countries, often performed back-to-back with barely any recovery time in between. So here's a fair question. How does anyone's body actually hold up to that? For Lisa, the answer isn't really found in a conventional gym. It's found somewhere far less glamorous, a dance practice room hour after hour for most of her life. In this video, we're breaking down what's actually known about how Lisa physically prepares for the demands of performing. Not a manufactured fitness plan, but a real, years-long pattern built almost entirely around dance itself, refined gradually over the better part of a decade in one of the most physically demanding corners of the entertainment industry. Let's start with exactly why this kind of physical demand exists in the first place, because understanding the job itself is really the key to understanding her training. Section 1. The physical reality of a world tour. It's easy, watching a polished concert from the audience, to forget just how physically demanding the performance actually is. A typical K-pop stadium set involves singing live while executing tightly choreographed high-intensity dance routines, often for nearly 2 hours, under stage lighting that adds its own heat and physical strain. There's no real opportunity to pace yourself the way an endurance athlete might during a long event. The choreography is set, the tempo is set, and the performance has to land the same way, full effort, from the first song to the last encore. Multiply that by dozens of shows across a touring cycle, layered on top of long-haul travel, repeated time zone changes, and a steady stream of promotional obligations squeezed in around performance dates. And you start to understand why physical conditioning isn't optional in this line of work. It's a basic requirement of the job, closer to what you'd expect from a professional athlete's schedule than a typical musician's. For Lisa specifically, that requirement isn't new, and it didn't appear suddenly once Blackpink started selling out stadiums. It goes back to long before the group ever debuted, to a period that, by her own account, shaped her relationship with physical endurance more than anything that came after it. Section 2, where her conditioning actually began. The trainee years. Lisa trained with YG Entertainment for several years before Blackpink's 2016 debut, and even by the standards of an industry known for demanding trainee schedules, her own description of those years stands out. She's described a typical day during that period as running from noon until midnight in scheduled class time, with her own additional practice often continuing well past that, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. By her own account, it was difficult, but she's framed it as worth the effort. That detail matters for understanding her current training, because it establishes something important. Long before fitness routine was ever a category fans were curious about, dance itself was already functioning as her primary form of physical conditioning, simply by necessity. There was no separate workout layered on top of training. The training itself was the workout, for hours at a stretch, day after day, often well past the point most people would consider a normal working day to be over. It's also worth noting that this kind of schedule wasn't unique to her individually. It reflects a broader pattern common across the K-pop trainee system generally, where aspiring idols often spend years in intensive vocal, dance, and language training before ever debuting, with no guarantee that the years of work will lead to an actual debut at all. What stands out in Lisa's specific case isn't that the system itself was unusually demanding. Plenty of trainees go through comparably long days, but that she's spoken about pushing herself even further within that system, voluntarily extending her own practice time beyond what was formally required of her. That foundational pattern, dance as the primary physical discipline, rather than something added around the edges of it, has carried through essentially unchanged into her career as a performing artist today, even as the context around her has changed dramatically. Section 3. Dance as the core of her training today. According to multiple reports drawing on her own comments, Lisa has continued to treat dance practice as the foundation of her physical conditioning well into her professional career, rather than relying primarily on separate gym-based training. She's been specifically described, alongside fellow member Jisoo, as relying on the sheer volume of demanding dance rehearsal hours as her main form of exercise, rather than maintaining a separate structured workout routine layered on top of it. That approach extends directly into touring itself. She's indicated that the physical demands of an actual concert function as a complete workout on their own, intense enough on a performance night that she doesn't necessarily need additional training that same day. Given the choreography style Blackpink is known for, sharp, full-body, stamina-intensive routines sustained across a full set list, that's a fairly reasonable claim. A single concert easily rivals, and likely exceeds, the cardiovascular and muscular demands of a typical high-intensity gym session, especially when you factor in the heat of stage lighting, the adrenaline of a live performance, and the sustained vocal effort happening simultaneously with the choreography. It's worth pausing on what this actually represents. Most fitness content frames training and performing as two separate categories. You train in order to be ready to perform. For Lisa, based on her own description, the line between those two categories appears to be far blurrier. The performance itself is, in a very real sense, also the training. It's a continuous loop rather than a clear before and after. Rehearsal builds the conditioning needed for a show, and the show itself reinforces and tests that same conditioning in front of tens of thousands of people, night after night. Section 4. What she adds beyond dance. Pilates. That said, dance alone doesn't appear to be the entirety of her physical routine. During periods when she isn't actively touring, Lisa has been described as incorporating Pilates into her routine as an additional form of exercise. Her Pilates practice has reportedly included some use of light dumbbells, specifically chosen to support flexibility and core stability work, rather than heavier resistance training. This makes practical sense alongside a dance-heavy schedule. Pilates is widely used among professional dancers and performers generally, precisely because it reinforces core strength, postural control, and flexibility, all qualities that directly support the kind of sustained, precise movement required in dance choreography, without adding the kind of bulk or fatigue that heavier strength training might introduce into an already demanding rehearsal schedule. For a performer whose body is already absorbing hours of repetitive, high-impact movement through dance, an exercise method built around control and alignment rather than maximal exertion fits logically into the gaps left over. It's a detail that fits the broader pattern here. Rather than training in a way that exists separately from her performance needs, even her supplementary training appears to be selected specifically because it reinforces the same physical qualities her dancing already demands of her: flexibility, balance, core engagement, and the kind of controlled strength that supports sharp, precise movement rather than raw power alone. Section 5. A more unexpected habit. Boxing. Here's where her training history includes something a little less predictable than dance and Pilates. During the Blackpink House reality series, Lisa was shown visiting a boxing gym and working through boxing fundamentals with a trainer, a detail that gave fans a rare, documented glimpse into a side of her physical routine outside of the dance studio. Boxing, even at a fairly introductory level, brings a different physical element into the mix than dance or Pilates alone, particularly footwork conditioning, upper body coordination, and the kind of explosive, controlled movement that doesn't necessarily overlap with structured choreography. There's also a mental component to boxing training that's worth mentioning briefly. The focus and reaction time demands of working with a trainer on pads or mitts require a different kind of concentration than memorized choreography, even if some of the underlying athleticism overlaps. Whether this was a one-off activity captured for the show, or something she's continued more consistently since, hasn't been clearly confirmed beyond that documented appearance. So it's worth treating as a real, but specifically time-stamped, glimpse into her training, rather than assuming it's a constant, ongoing part of her routine today. Still, even as a single documented moment, it adds an interesting layer to the broader picture. Someone whose primary physical language is dance, but who's also shown a willingness to step into entirely different physical disciplines when the opportunity arises, rather than sticking rigidly to one familiar mode of training. Section 6. The cultural roots behind her movement style. It's worth spending a moment on where Lisa's actual dance foundation comes from, since that foundation is really the backbone of everything else in her physical training. Her movement style, as showcased throughout Blackpink's choreography, draws heavily on hip-hop fundamentals, sharp isolations, grounded power, and the kind of precise, percussive movement that's become closely associated with her stage presence specifically, often singled out by choreographers and fellow dancers as one of her strongest technical traits. According to some retrospective profiles of her dance background, that foundation has also been described as layered with contemporary dance influences, alongside elements connected to her early exposure to Thai traditional dance growing up. This particular detail is worth treating with a bit more caution than the rest of this video, since it's less rigorously confirmed through direct interviews than her trainee-era comments or her documented Pilates and boxing moments. But it's a reasonable, frequently cited piece of context for understanding how her specific movement vocabulary developed over time, blending multiple traditions into the style fans now recognize instantly on stage. What's worth taking from this, even with appropriate caution around the specifics, is that her physical training was never built in a vacuum. It developed across multiple dance traditions and cultural contexts over the course of her life, well before she ever set foot in a YG training room. Meaning the foundation for her current conditioning was being laid, in a sense, from childhood onward, long before training for K-pop was ever part of the plan. Section 7. Fuel, not restriction. Her approach to energy and recovery. Given how physically demanding her training and performance schedule is, it's worth touching briefly on how she's talked about supporting that output, without veering into specifics about diet or body composition, which isn't really the point of this video anyway. Lisa has stated that she doesn't follow a restrictive diet, and has specifically emphasized the importance of eating enough to maintain energy through intense practice sessions, at one point. Telling trainees on the show Youth With You that having a full stomach matters during demanding rehearsal periods, since a lack of food means a lack of energy to actually get through the work. That's a meaningfully different framing than the typical idol diet narrative that tends to dominate K-pop fitness content online. Rather than treating food as something to minimize or control tightly, her own comments suggest she treats it as fuel, a practical requirement for sustaining the kind of physical output her training demands, rather than something to be restricted around an image-driven goal. Given how much of her actual training is built around sheer physical endurance, that framing tracks logically. Someone spending most of their day in intense dance practice needs consistent energy intake simply to keep functioning, let alone performing at a high level night after night, for months at a stretch. Recovery, in a broader sense, is also worth touching on here. Not because specific details about Lisa's personal recovery routine have been extensively documented, but because it's a meaningful, often overlooked part of the picture for any performer maintaining a schedule like hers. Professional dancers and touring performers generally rely on a combination of adequate sleep, hydration, and lower-intensity recovery days between intense rehearsal or performance blocks, simply because the body can't sustain maximal output indefinitely without some form of active recovery built in. While Lisa hasn't laid out a detailed personal recovery protocol publicly, it's reasonable to assume, based on the sheer physical demands already described, that some version of structured rest plays a role in how she's able to maintain this pace year after year, even if the specific details haven't been shared. Section 8. What all of this reveals about her as a performer. Step back from the individual pieces, the trainee-era late nights, the dance as workout philosophy, the Pilates, the brief but real boxing glimpse, the cultural roots behind her movement style, and a clear picture starts to form. This isn't a celebrity fitness routine assembled for the cameras or built around aesthetic goals. It's a physical practice shaped almost entirely by the actual functional demands of her job, refined gradually over close to a decade of professional performing, and rooted in habits that go back even further, to her earliest years training before she'd ever performed for an audience at all. That's a meaningfully different story than most celebrity workout routine content tends to tell. There's no elaborate manufactured program here designed primarily to be replicated or admired from the outside. There's simply a performer whose job has always demanded an extraordinary level of physical output, who built her conditioning directly around meeting that demand. Year after year, tour after tour, supplementing it where it made practical sense, but never losing sight of the fact that the dancing itself was always doing most of the work. It also says something about consistency over time. The same willingness to push past required practice hours that she described as a teenage trainee seems to echo, in a quieter way, through how she's continued to approach her physical training as an adult performer. Less about chasing a specific look, and more about simply meeting whatever the job in front of her actually requires. So, how does Lisa actually stay stage ready for the physical demands of a world tour? Based on what's actually been documented, the answer isn't a secret training program or an elaborate gym routine. It's years of dance practice that began long before she ever debuted, supplemented by Pilates for core stability, a documented stretch of boxing training along the way, and an approach to food built around sustaining energy rather than restricting it. It's a reminder that, behind the polish of a stadium performance, what's really being showcased is the result of relentless, practical physical discipline, built not for appearance, but simply to meet the demands of the job, night after night, tour after tour, in a career where the line between training and performing has, by her own account, barely ever really existed. If you found this breakdown interesting, let us know in the comments what surprised you most about her training. And subscribe if you'd like more carefully researched looks into the work ethic behind your favorite K-pop performers.